Friends, thank you for joining me today. We are living through a moment that reveals perhaps more clearly than ever the hidden mechanics of power in the global economy. For decades, Americans have been told that this country is too powerful, too wealthy, too indispensable to ever bow before anyone. Yet today, the United States finds itself in a position that borders on humiliation. The very rivals that Washington sought to lecture and control, China and India, are now demanding payback on nearly $1 trillion of U.S. debt. And Donald Trump, the man who once promised America would win so much you'll be tired of winning, is suddenly confronting the reality of dependence, weakness, and panic. Now, before dismissing this as some distant financial story, we need to understand what this means for ordinary Americans. This is not about abstract numbers on a government spreadsheet. It's about the real possibility of higher borrowing costs, collapsing markets, and a weakened dollar that could make everything from mortgages to groceries more expensive for millions of families. And here is the deeper irony. The crisis was not created by America's enemies, but by the reckless policies of its own leader. Trump called himself a businessman, a dealmaker, a man who would run the nation like one of his successful enterprises. But what is unfolding today suggests the opposite. He ran America like one of his bankrupt casinos, borrowing recklessly, cutting taxes for the wealthy, and picking fights abroad that drained resources instead of building strength. This is not just the story of one man's political failure. It is the story of how the world's largest economy has been caught in a trap of its own making, a trap that gives Beijing and Delhi more leverage over Washington than at any point in modern history. And to fully grasp how we reach this moment, we need to begin with Trump's own approach to debt, the promises he made, the policies he enacted, and the contradictions that are now exploding in America's face. When Donald Trump campaigned for the presidency, he promised something extraordinary, that he, a self-proclaimed master businessman, would bring the same genius that built his empire to the management of the American economy. He told farmers, workers, and small business owners that under his leadership, America would no longer be held hostage by debt or by foreign creditors. Instead, the United States would be financially independent, strong, and untouchable. But when we peel back the curtain, we see the opposite. During Trump's years in office, the national debt exploded at one of the fastest rates in modern history. His massive tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy did not generate new revenue as promised. Instead, they hollowed out the government's income, leaving gaping deficits that had to be filled with borrowed money. At the same time, Trump's trade wars, particularly with China, were sold to the public as bold acts of economic patriotism. Tariffs, he argued, would bring jobs back, protect American workers, and punish unfair practices abroad. Yet in practice, those tariffs triggered retaliation. Export markets closed to American goods, farm income plummeted, and the government responded not by fixing the problem, but by writing billions in subsidy checks. Where did that money come from? More borrowing. The result was a perfect storm. Revenues shrank, spending soared, and the gap between what the United States earned and what it owed widened into a chasm. Trump had not tamed the debt, he had supercharged it. And here lies the deepest contradiction. The man who branded himself as the businessman president, who promised to manage the economy with the discipline of a boardroom, treated the nation's finances with the same recklessness that drove many of his ventures into bankruptcy. He ran the United States as though debt itself were free, and now the bill is coming due. But this is not just about numbers on a federal balance sheet, because every dollar the United States borrowed had to come from somewhere, and increasingly, it came from the very countries Trump mocked, threatened, and underestimated. Which brings us to the uncomfortable reality of today. China and India, two of America's fiercest rivals, now stand as its creditors. To understand the magnitude of this crisis, we must look at who holds America's debt. For years, the single largest foreign creditor to the United States has been China. Washington's fiercest rival, the country Trump repeatedly targeted with tariffs and insults, quietly accumulated hundreds of billions of dollars in U.S. Treasury bonds. These bonds are not just pieces of paper. They are promises that America will pay back what it owes with interest to the very government Trump tried to humiliate. And while China has long been the focus, there is a new and equally significant player: India. Over the past decade, India has steadily increased its holdings of U.S. debt, becoming one of Washington's fastest-growing creditors. For Delhi, these bonds are more than investments. They are leverage. They represent a tool of influence in a world where financial power often matters more than military might. Here lies the striking irony. Trump told his supporters that he would put America first, that he would force China and India to respect U.S. strength. Yet by ballooning the deficit, he placed America's financial future in their hands. Every treasury bond held in Beijing or Delhi is a reminder that the United States cannot finance its own government without the help of the very nations Trump sought to demean. Think about what this means strategically. It means that when China and India demand changes to trade rules or resist U.S. foreign policy, they do so not from a position of weakness, but from one of confidence. They know that America's dependence on their money gives them bargaining power unlike anything they held in the past. And this is not speculation. In recent months, both China and India have begun signaling their intent to reduce reliance on the dollar, to sell U.S. debt, and to use their financial clout as a weapon in global negotiations. What was once an unthinkable scenario, America's rivals holding its leash, is now the reality of the 21st century. But the story doesn't end with who owns the debt. The real danger lies in what happens if those creditors decide to act, to pull back, or to demand repayment. That is where the shock comes in. And it is a shock that could send tremors through the entire global economy. When we speak of debt, the numbers are so vast, they often lose meaning. But let us pause here. China and India together hold close to $1 trillion of U.S. obligations. That is not a statistic on a government report. That is a sword hanging over the head of the American economy. Why does it matter? Because the U.S. economy, for all its size, rests on a fragile foundation of trust. Every time Washington issues treasury bonds, it is essentially saying to the world, lend us money now, and we promise to repay you later. As long as buyers believe in that promise, the system works. But what happens if those buyers, especially ones as powerful as China and India, decide they no longer trust it? The consequences would be immediate and brutal. If Beijing or Delhi began selling off U.S. debt in large quantities, the value of those bonds would fall. To attract new buyers, Washington would have to raise interest rates. That, in turn, would ripple across the economy. Higher mortgage costs, higher credit card rates, higher borrowing costs for businesses and consumers alike. And it would not stop there. The dollar, long considered the safe haven of the global economy, would suddenly look less secure. A large-scale sell-off could weaken its value, driving up the price of imports, fueling inflation, and shaking Wall Street to its core. This is why $1 trillion in foreign-held U.S. debt is not just a financial figure. It is a pressure point, one that America's rivals can press whenever it suits their interests. One move from Beijing or Delhi could send shockwaves across the globe, toppling stock markets, destabilizing the dollar, and plunging the United States into a financial crisis of its own making. And the most unsettling part of all, this vulnerability was not inevitable. It was manufactured by reckless policy choices, by arrogance, and by a leadership that believed debt could grow forever without consequence. Which brings us to the deeper story, how Trump's own policies created the very trap America is now caught in. Donald Trump's economic playbook was built on a contradiction. On the one hand, he promised Americans that his tariffs and trade wars would make the country stronger, more independent, and less vulnerable to foreign pressure. On the other hand, the very policies he pursued forced the United States to rely even more heavily on foreign creditors, including its rivals. Consider the tariffs. Trump imposed them as weapons designed to punish China, Europe, and even Canada and Mexico. But tariffs are not free. They raised costs for American companies, driving up prices for consumers, while also provoking retaliation abroad. China responded by slashing purchases of American goods, especially agricultural exports. That left Washington with a problem: collapsing farm income and mounting anger in rural America. The solution was not to rethink the policy, but to paper over the damage with billions of dollars in subsidies. And where did that money come from? Borrowing. The government issued more debt to keep farmers afloat, which meant leaning even harder on China, India, and other buyers of U.S. treasuries. Meanwhile, Trump's tax cuts drained federal revenues. Corporations and the wealthy enjoyed windfalls, but the government's coffers grew emptier. Again, the gap had to be filled with borrowing. The irony could not be clearer. Trump, the self-styled defender of American sovereignty, financed his economic agenda by deepening America's dependence on foreign creditors. And let us not forget the damage done to alliances. By alienating Europe, Canada, and other traditional partners, Trump left the United States with fewer friendly buyers of its debt. That vacuum was filled by rivals who were more than willing to lend money, but at a price. So when Trump promised America first, the reality became America indebted. His policies, marketed as tools of liberation, ended up chaining the country more tightly to its competitors. And now, as China and India flex their financial muscles, the backfire is complete. America is discovering that its enemies hold the very IOUs it cannot afford to repay. But if Washington is trapped, others are thriving. Because while America struggles under the weight of its own contradictions, China, India, and their partners are seizing the opportunity to build a new financial order. Every collapse produces winners as well as losers, and in this case, the beneficiaries of Trump's failed debt policies are clear. China, already the largest holder of U.S. debt, uses its position to push forward a long-standing ambition: to elevate the yuan as a global reserve currency. Each time Washington stumbles, Beijing argues that the world should diversify away from the dollar. And the more America depends on Chinese lending, the more persuasive that argument becomes. What began as a defensive strategy to protect China's vast holdings has now become an offensive strategy to reshape global finance itself. India, too, sees an opening. Long overshadowed by China in global economic affairs, Delhi has quietly expanded its influence by increasing purchases of U.S. debt and then using that leverage in trade and diplomatic negotiations. Instead of being lectured by Washington, Indian leaders now find themselves in a position to lecture back, reminding the U.S. that its access to credit depends on cooperation, not bullying. And beyond these two powers lies the wider BRICS bloc. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa have spent years developing alternatives to Western-dominated institutions like the IMF and World Bank. Now, with America weakened by its debt addiction, BRICS can present itself as a credible alternative order, one that promises to free nations from the dominance of the U.S. dollar. This is the paradox. Trump launched his trade wars to weaken rivals and reassert American primacy. Instead, he accelerated their rise. China can now position itself as a financial safe haven. India gains newfound bargaining power. BRICS markets itself as the future. And America, once the unquestioned center of the global economy, finds itself in the awkward position of begging its competitors to keep lending. But if the winners are abroad, the pain of this crisis is being felt most acutely at home. Because for ordinary Americans, the consequences of Trump's debt explosion are not abstract. They show up in household budgets, in rising prices, and in a standard of living that continues to erode. It is one thing to talk about trillions of dollars in global debt markets, but the true weight of this crisis falls on the American people. For households already struggling with stagnant wages and rising costs, Trump's policies have added another invisible tax: the cost of borrowing itself. As Washington issues more debt to cover its deficits, interest rates climb. That means higher mortgage payments for families hoping to buy their first home. It means credit card bills that grow faster than paychecks. It means small businesses forced to cut back on investment because loans have become too expensive. Debt at the federal level becomes debt in the kitchen table economy. And then there's the dollar. If China or India pull back from U.S. treasuries, the value of the dollar weakens. That sounds abstract, but the consequences are immediate. Imported goods become more expensive, inflation accelerates, and the cost of living, already a source of widespread anger, rises even further. Farmers and workers, the very people Trump promised to protect, are among the hardest hit. Export markets lost to tariffs never fully return, while input costs for fuel, fertilizer, and equipment keep climbing. The subsidies meant to keep them afloat are swallowed by debt servicing, leaving rural America more precarious than before. In other words, the debt trap is not just a Washington problem. It is a crisis of everyday life. The myth that America can borrow endlessly without consequence has finally reached its breaking point, and the people paying the price are not the elites who benefited from tax cuts or corporate subsidies. They are the millions of ordinary Americans now squeezed between rising debts and shrinking opportunities. But perhaps the most profound impact is not economic alone, it is psychological and political. The realization that the United States is no longer financially untouchable. And that realization brings us to the larger meaning of this crisis. The collapse of Trump's economic promises is not just about budgets, deficits, or even $1 trillion in debt. It is about the unraveling of a national illusion. For generations, Americans were told that their country's power rested on two pillars: military might and financial supremacy, tanks and aircraft on one side, the almighty dollar on the other. Trump boasted that he would strengthen both. Instead, his policies have exposed how fragile that second pillar truly is. What this crisis reveals is that American power is not unlimited. It is contingent on the willingness of foreign governments, including rivals, to continue lending. The empire does not collapse when it loses a battle. It collapses when it cannot pay its bills. And that is precisely the vulnerability now laid bare. China and India do not need to fire a shot to weaken Washington. They need only to reconsider their bond purchases, to shift toward alternative currencies, to demand repayment terms that serve their interests. Each of these steps chips away at the dollar's dominance and, by extension, at America's global influence. This is why Trump's "America First" slogan was always an illusion. There can be no independence when the nation's finances are in the hands of others. There can be no dominance when rivals hold your debt. What we are witnessing is the steady erosion of U.S. sovereignty, not through conquest, but through accounting. And the symbolism matters. When the world sees that the United States, once thought to be financially untouchable, is now exposed to the demands of Beijing and Delhi, the aura of inevitability around American leadership begins to fade. That aura, more than weapons, more than rhetoric, has been the foundation of U.S. global power. Its erosion signals a new era. But to understand how we reached this point, we must return to the man at the center of it, Donald Trump. Because while the structural weaknesses were decades in the making, it was his ego, his recklessness, and his contradictions that accelerated the collapse. At the heart of this crisis stands Donald Trump. He sold himself as a genius businessman, a defender of the forgotten American, a leader who would finally free the nation from dependence on others. But history will remember something very different. His tax cuts for the wealthy drained the treasury. His tariffs triggered retaliation that forced Washington to borrow more. His bullying of allies left America reliant on the very rivals he claimed to defeat. In the end, Trump did not protect America. He exposed it. He turned the world's largest economy into the world's largest debtor, and then handed the bill to China and India. What he called America First has become America indebted, America weakened, America on its knees. Friends, what we are witnessing is not a passing storm. It is the structural consequence of reckless policies that promised greatness but delivered dependence. $1 trillion of U.S. debt now rests in the hands of China and India. Global markets watch as America stumbles. Ordinary families brace for higher costs and greater insecurity. And the very man who vowed to shield the nation from weakness left it more vulnerable than at any time in recent history. Trump promised that America would never kneel. Yet today, Washington bends under the weight of its own debt, while Beijing and Delhi hold the terms. This is not just Trump's failure. It is a turning point. The moment when the illusion of American financial supremacy gave way to the reality of dependence. The question before us now is simple. If America cannot even manage its own debt without bowing to rivals, what does that mean for its future as a superpower? And what happens when the next crisis, in oil, lithium, or food, exposes even deeper vulnerabilities?